Deep in the frozen Ardennes, Hitler launched his final, desperate gamble. Thousands of Allied troops, exhausted and unprepared, faced a brutal surprise attack. The skies were dark, the roads impassable, and the enemy unstoppable. This wasn't just another battle. This was Hitler's last throw of the dice, an all-or-nothing strike that, if successful, could change the course of history. But what went wrong, and why did it end in disaster? By late 1944, the Allies were winning. Paris was liberated, Germany was retreating, but Hitler had one last plan: launch a surprise attack through Belgium, split the Allies in two, and force them to negotiate peace on his terms. It was bold, it was reckless, and for a moment, it worked. For 6 weeks, the world held its breath, but in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, something happened that Hitler never expected. A stand that would break his last gamble and seal the fate of Nazi Germany. December 1944, the Third Reich is collapsing. To the east, the Soviet Red Army is tearing through Poland, pushing ever closer to Berlin. To the west, American and British forces have smashed through France and are standing at Germany's doorstep. The once mighty German war machine is breaking apart. Supplies are running out, morale is crumbling. Defeat seems unavoidable. But in Hitler's mind, there is no room for surrender. He sees a way out. A bold, last-ditch effort that could change everything. His generals warn him, it's reckless, nearly impossible, but he won't listen. He believes a single decisive blow can turn the tide of the war. If he can strike hard enough, if he can divide the British and American forces, he might force the Allies to negotiate. If that happens, Germany could turn its full attention to the Soviet Union. It's a gamble, a final roll of the dice, and it all hinges on a place few would expect: the Ardennes. Hitler's plan is fearless. The Ardennes is a thick, heavily forested region in Belgium, full of narrow, winding roads and steep hills. In 1940, German forces had shocked the world by blitzing through it, bypassing French defenses, and crushing the Allies in a matter of weeks. Hitler believes he can do it again. The Americans are stretched thin and overconfident. They don't believe a serious German attack is possible here. Their lines are weak, defended mostly by young, inexperienced soldiers. Perfect targets. Hitler orders 3 armies, more than 200,000 troops, to launch the attack. Nearly 1,000 tanks, including the deadly Tiger II, will spearhead the assault. Their objective? Smash through the American lines, race to the vital port of Antwerp, and cut off the Allied forces in two. But there's a problem. Germany is running out of fuel. Every tank, every vehicle, every movement must be carefully calculated. There isn't enough gasoline for a prolonged fight. The plan only works if German troops capture Allied fuel depots along the way. If they don't, the offensive will grind to a halt. Hitler doesn't care. He believes in willpower over logistics. His officers protest. What if they run out of fuel before reaching their objectives? His response is chilling. Then we will use captured American fuel. And so, with barely enough supplies, Germany prepares for its final great offensive. To keep the Allies guessing, Hitler gave the operation a deceptive name: Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, or Operation Watch on the Rhine. He wants enemy intelligence to think Germany is simply reinforcing its defenses, not preparing for a massive attack. Meanwhile, an elite force of German commandos is given a secret mission. These men, trained in English and dressed in American uniforms, are sent behind enemy lines. Their orders are simple: cut telephone wires, misdirect reinforcements, change road signs, and spread panic. If caught, they will be executed as spies. But Hitler has another, more terrifying order. There will be no mercy. American prisoners will be killed on the spot. The objective is to break morale, to send a message. This is not a retreating army. This is an army coming back for blood. On December 16th before dawn, the quiet forests of the Ardennes are about to erupt into chaos. At 5:30 a.m., German artillery opens fire. Over 1,600 guns rain shells onto American positions. The bombardment is deafening. Trees explode into splinters. Trenches collapse. Soldiers, half asleep in their foxholes, wake up to pure terror. Then from the mist, they come. Wave after wave of German troops. Tanks roll forward, crushing barbed wire and defenses. The Americans, completely caught off guard, scramble to respond. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. Chaos spreads like wildfire. At the front lines, young American soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat, face an unstoppable force. Communications are cut. The roads are clogged with confused and panicked troops. Some units manage to put up resistance, but they are quickly overwhelmed. In some areas, German troops infiltrate disguised as Americans. They change road signs, sabotage supply routes, and spread misinformation. American officers receive conflicting reports. Some say the Germans are attacking in force. Others insist it's just a minor skirmish. No one realizes the scale of what's happening. By midday, the German attack is in full force. The spearheads punch deep into American lines, pushing them back mile by mile. The Ardennes is turning into a death trap. One of the hardest hit areas is the small Belgian town of Schoenberg. Here, the 106th Infantry Division, mostly young and inexperienced soldiers, finds itself surrounded. The Germans encircle them, cutting off all escape routes. By nightfall, thousands of Americans are either dead, captured, or desperately trying to hold their ground. Further south, in Bastogne, another American division braces for the onslaught. The town sits at a vital crossroads. If it falls, the German advance will be unstoppable. The men of the 101st Airborne, battle-hardened but vastly outnumbered, dig in. The Germans are coming, and they won't stop until Bastogne is in ruins. As night falls, the temperature drops below freezing. The wounded lie in the snow, their cries muffled by the howling wind. German troops press forward, their tanks rolling past burning American vehicles. Supplies run low, ammunition is scarce, and reinforcements are nowhere in sight. But there's one thing the Germans didn't expect. The Americans aren't breaking. Against all odds, pockets of resistance form. Machine gunners hold key intersections, bazooka teams ambush unsuspecting tanks, and radio operators, despite the chaos, send desperate calls for reinforcements. The Germans expected a quick victory. Instead, they are walking into a nightmare of their own making. Then, an order comes from a German commander: no prisoners. In a small Belgian village called Malmedy, over 80 captured American soldiers are lined up in an open field. Without warning, machine guns open fire. The men drop, some instantly killed, others wounded and left to die in the snow. The massacre at Malmedy becomes a rallying cry for American troops. This is no ordinary battle. This is a fight for survival. Across the front, American units fight desperately to hold the line. Some retreat in chaos, others make a stand. The German offensive is brutal, but time is slipping away. Every hour the Americans hold on is another hour for reinforcements to arrive. The Battle of the Bulge is far from over. But one thing is certain: this will not be the easy victory Hitler envisioned. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes are chilling silent. The ground is frozen solid, and every breath of the trapped American soldiers turns to mist in the bitter December air. Bastogne, a small, strategically vital Belgian town, now stands as the last major obstacle in Hitler's grand offensive. The German war machine is closing in. Inside the town, the men of the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, prepare for the inevitable. They are cold, exhausted, and dangerously low on supplies. Food is rationed, and some men survive on what little they can scavenge. Ammunition is running out. The wounded lie in makeshift aid stations, shivering from both injuries and the brutal winter chill. Then comes the dreaded order: complete encirclement. The Germans have surrounded Bastogne, cutting off all roads leading in or out. The Americans are trapped. German artillery begins its relentless bombardment. Shells explode in the town center, sending debris flying through the icy streets. Buildings collapse, turning Bastogne into a maze of ruins. The American troops hold their positions, crouching in foxholes and ruined houses, gripping their weapons tightly. The German forces, far superior in numbers and firepower, expect a swift victory. Their tanks rumble forward, supported by waves of infantry. The defenders, outgunned and outnumbered, have only one option: hold the line at all costs. The first attacks are repelled with sheer grit and determination. A handful of Sherman tanks from the 10th Armored Division engage the advancing German panzers, firing round after round. Machine gunners empty their belts into waves of enemy soldiers. The air is filled with the deafening roar of battle, but the reality is grim. Bastogne's defenders are fighting with their backs against the wall, and without reinforcements, it is only a matter of time before the Germans break through. On the morning of December 22nd, a group of German officers approaches the American lines under a white flag. They carry a written demand for surrender, addressed to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The message is clear: the honorable surrender of the town of Bastogne is the only way to avoid complete annihilation. McAuliffe reads the letter. He looks up at his officers, then bursts into laughter. The room falls silent. He picks up a pen, scrawls a single word on a piece of paper, and hands it to the German envoy. Nuts! The German officers are confused. One of McAuliffe's men clarifies, "It means go to hell." The German delegation departs. The battle continues. The siege drags on. The temperature plummets. The men in Bastogne endure one of the coldest winters in European history. Their rations dwindle. Many lack proper winter clothing. Some wrap their feet in burlap sacks to keep from freezing. Frostbite claims almost as many men as enemy bullets. The shelling never stops. The Germans launch attack after attack, trying to break through American defenses. At night, the glow of burning buildings lights up the sky. Sleep is a luxury no one can afford. Yet the 101st Airborne does not surrender. They fight in small squads, holding crossroads, ambushing enemy patrols, and launching desperate counterattacks. They know that as long as they hold Bastogne, they are keeping the German advance bottled up. But they cannot hold out forever. They need help. Hundreds of miles south of Bastogne, General George S. Patton is already preparing for battle. While the men of the 101st Airborne fight for survival, Patton is moving his army at an unmatched speed. 3 days earlier, on December 19th, Patton had met with General Eisenhower. The situation in the Ardennes was dire. Bastogne was cut off, and the German offensive was threatening to split the Allied front in half. Patton had a bold plan. While most generals would need weeks to reposition an army, Patton promised he could pivot his entire Third Army, 100,000 men, thousands of tanks and vehicles, and head north to relieve Bastogne in just 48 hours. Eisenhower was skeptical. The roads were frozen, covered in snow. The men were exhausted, already engaged in combat. But if anyone could pull it off, it was Patton. And so the order was given: move out. The scale of the operation was staggering. Patton's men marched and drove through snow-covered roads at an almost impossible pace. Engineers worked around the clock to clear paths, while tanks pushed through ice-covered forests. The weather was brutal. Soldiers trudged forward in knee-deep snow, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Trucks skidded off roads. Tanks broke down. But they kept moving. Patton knew the importance of speed. Every hour counted. The men in Bastogne were running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. They had no idea help was coming. As Patton's forces advanced, they encountered fierce German resistance. The enemy knew that if Bastogne held, their entire offensive would collapse. The fighting was savage. Small towns became battlegrounds and crossroads turned into killing fields. But Patton's men pushed forward, refusing to stop. By December 23rd, they were close, but Bastogne was still under siege, and the Germans were preparing for a final assault to wipe out the defenders. The Americans inside the town were fighting with their last bullets. Then, almost miraculously, the sky cleared. For the first time in days, the sun broke through the thick clouds, and with it came the roar of aircraft engines. American P-47 Thunderbolts and B-26 bombers soared over Bastogne, strafing German positions, dropping supplies, and obliterating enemy tanks. The 101st had been starving, freezing, barely holding on, but now reinforcements were coming. The Germans had counted on bad weather to keep the skies closed. Now they were exposed, and Patton's forces were closing in. Christmas Eve, 1944. The battle for Bastogne reaches its climax. The Germans launch one final desperate attack. They throw everything they have, tanks, artillery, infantry, trying to crush the American defenders before Patton arrives. Fighting rages through the night. The streets of Bastogne are filled with gunfire, explosions, and screams. American soldiers fight hand-to-hand in the ruins of buildings. And then, on December 26, the breakthrough comes. Patton's lead tank column smashes through German lines and reaches the outskirts of Bastogne. The defenders, barely able to stand from exhaustion, watch in disbelief as the first Sherman tanks roll in. A cheer erupts. The siege is over, but the battle is far from finished. The relief of Bastogne was a turning point, but the Battle of the Bulge was far from over. Despite mounting losses, Hitler refused to admit defeat. He ordered his commanders to press forward, insisting that victory was still within reach. But reality told a different story. The Germans were running out of fuel. Their tanks, once the spearhead of the offensive, were becoming useless. Without fuel, they were abandoned on roadsides, turned into makeshift bunkers, or simply left behind in the snow. Soldiers had to advance on foot, carrying weapons and supplies through the freezing Ardennes. Morale was crumbling. German units were scattered, cut off from reinforcements, and struggling to hold their positions. The grand offensive was unraveling, and then the full might of the Allied war machine came crashing down. With the skies now clear, American and British aircraft dominated the battlefield. Fighter planes hunted down German convoys, while bombers pounded enemy positions. What had been a surprise German advance now turned into a slaughter. In villages and forests, entire German columns were wiped out. Soldiers who had once been the hunters were now the hunted. But Hitler still refused to retreat. His orders were clear: fight to the last man. For the Germans, surrender was not an option. Many knew what awaited them if they were captured. Some fought to the bitter end. Others, realizing the futility, deserted in the dead of night, disappearing into the woods. By late December, the Allies had fully regained the initiative. Patton's Third Army pushed forward relentlessly, smashing through German lines and reclaiming lost ground. Eisenhower ordered a coordinated counterattack to force the Germans back once and for all. Slowly, the front line collapsed. German forces, exhausted and disorganized, had no choice but to retreat. The mighty Ardennes offensive, the last hope of the Third Reich, was disintegrating. But Hitler still clung to hope. He believed that if his forces could hold on just a little longer, he could negotiate a ceasefire. He was wrong. By the first week of January, the tide had turned completely. The roads were littered with destroyed German tanks and abandoned vehicles. American soldiers advanced cautiously, knowing that desperate enemy troops were still hiding in the forests. What had started as Hitler's final gamble had become a nightmare for the German army. They had lost thousands of men, burned through their fuel reserves, and failed to achieve their objectives. The Allies had survived the largest German offensive of the war, and now they were preparing for their own final push, straight into the heart of Germany. For the Third Reich, the Battle of the Bulge had been the last desperate attempt to turn the tide. But instead of breaking the Allies, it had shattered Hitler's own army. Within months, the Allies would be at the gates of Berlin. The war in Europe was nearing its bloody conclusion. But before that final chapter, the world would witness some of the most brutal battles of the war. And for Hitler, the dream of a Nazi empire was slipping away. As the guns fell silent over the Ardennes, the full scale of destruction became painfully clear. What had once been dense forests and peaceful villages had been transformed into a wasteland of burned-out vehicles, shattered trees, and unburied bodies. The battle, which had begun as a daring German counteroffensive, had ended in disaster. The Germans had thrown everything they had into the Ardennes offensive, believing that a decisive victory could turn the war around. But now their once-feared panzer divisions lay crippled. Entire tank regiments were either destroyed or abandoned. The roads were littered with the skeletal remains of German vehicles, left behind after fuel shortages forced their crews to flee on foot. For the Allies, the toll was devastating as well. This was the bloodiest battle the U.S. Army had fought in World War II. Over 80,000 American troops had been killed, wounded, or captured. Many were just young men, drafted into war, forced to endure unimaginable suffering in the freezing cold. The wounded who survived faced frostbite and amputations, their limbs blackened and dead from exposure. The civilians caught in the crossfire also paid a steep price. Towns across Belgium and Luxembourg were left in ruins, their homes shattered by artillery fire. Thousands of families had fled, leaving behind everything they owned, seeking shelter from the relentless fighting. For many, there was no home to return to. And then, there were the horrors that couldn't be measured in statistics. The war crimes, the acts of brutality, the memories that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The Germans' losses and Hitler's failed gamble. For Hitler, the Ardennes offensive had been a last desperate attempt to regain control of the war. It was a bold strategy, one that had initially caught the Allies off guard. But in the end, it had been a colossal failure. The German war machine had taken a hit from which it would never recover. The numbers were staggering. The Germans had suffered over 100,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Some divisions had been completely wiped out. The Waffen-SS, Hitler's elite fighting force, had been shattered. They had also lost over 600 tanks and assault guns, weapons they could no longer replace. Fuel supplies were depleted beyond recovery, leaving many of their remaining vehicles stranded and useless. The Luftwaffe, already a shadow of its former self, had lost hundreds of aircraft in desperate attempts to support ground troops. But perhaps the biggest loss was psychological. Hitler's aura of invincibility had been broken. In the years leading up to the Battle of the Bulge, many Germans had still clung to hope. Despite mounting defeats, they believed that the Führer could still pull off a miracle, just as he had in 1940 when Germany had crushed France in a matter of weeks. But now, after the failure in the Ardennes, even the most die-hard Nazi supporters could see the writing on the wall. The dream of a German victory was dead. The war was now a matter of survival, the cost to the Allies and the psychological toll. Though the Allies had won, victory had come at an enormous price. In the weeks following the battle, medics and burial crews worked tirelessly to recover the dead. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes hid thousands of frozen bodies, American and German alike. Many would never be identified. For the soldiers who had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the scars went beyond the physical. The extreme cold, the constant shelling, the fear of being surrounded. It had pushed many to their breaking points. Many of the men who had fought at Bastogne, Malmedy, in the Siegfried Line would later be diagnosed with what was then called battle fatigue, now known as PTSD. Some never spoke about what they had seen. Others relived the nightmare for the rest of their lives. But despite the suffering, one thing was clear. The Battle of the Bulge had been a turning point. The Germans had thrown everything they had into one last desperate attack, and they had failed. From this point forward, the Allies would push forward relentlessly. The road to Berlin was open, and for Hitler, the countdown to the end had begun. The Battle of the Bulge was not just another defeat for Germany. It was the moment when Hitler's dream of a Nazi victory truly shattered. For months, the Germans had fought desperately on both fronts, but after their failure in the Ardennes, the war was no longer a matter of winning. It was now a matter of delaying the inevitable. By early 1945, the German war machine was running on fumes. Factories had been bombed into rubble, fuel supplies were critically low, and fresh troops were almost impossible to find. Many of the soldiers who had fought in the Ardennes were irreplaceable veterans. Their loss weakened the Wehrmacht beyond repair. Meanwhile, the Allies knew they had the upper hand. With Germany's last offensive crushed, it was time to strike back harder than ever. The Western Front, once clogged by the Bulge, now opened wide. Eisenhower and his commanders wasted no time. The plan was simple: push into Germany and finish the war. The Soviets on the Eastern Front, the red tide advances. While the Americans, British, and their allies prepared to invade Germany from the west, an even greater force was moving in from the east, the Soviet Red Army. For Stalin, the failure of the Ardennes offensive meant one thing: Germany was now defenseless. On January 12, 1945, the Soviets launched Operation Vistula Oder, one of the largest offensives of the war. Over 2.5 million Soviet troops, backed by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, smashed through the weakened German lines in Poland. Cities like Warsaw and Krakow fell within days. German soldiers, many of them teenagers and old men, were thrown into the fight, but they were no match for the Soviet war machine. Within just 2 weeks, the Red Army had advanced nearly 300 miles. By February 1945, the Soviets were approaching the Oder River, just 50 miles from Berlin. Hitler had gambled everything on the Battle of the Bulge. Now his empire was collapsing on all sides. The Western Allies crossed into Germany. With the Germans retreating in the Ardennes, the Americans and British wasted no time taking advantage of their victory. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, pushed eastward with incredible speed. Town after town fell as German resistance crumbled. American tanks rolled through the Siegfried Line, the once impenetrable fortress guarding Germany's western border. On March 7, 1945, American forces achieved a historic breakthrough. They captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the last standing bridge over the Rhine River. It was a stunning victory. With the bridge intact, U.S. troops poured into Germany. Meanwhile, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery launched Operation Plunder in the north, a massive assault across the Rhine. Paratroopers from the British and American Airborne divisions dropped behind German lines, while artillery barrages shattered enemy defenses. Germany was now fully exposed. The war was entering its final brutal phase. By April 1945, the German army was barely holding together. Desertion skyrocketed. Entire units surrendered without a fight. Officers who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler now saw no reason to continue. Some even plotted against him. The once feared Luftwaffe was all but destroyed. Without fuel, planes sat useless in airfields. The mighty Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, was either sunk or trapped in port. In Berlin, Hitler's closest advisors pleaded with him to surrender, but the Führer refused. He still believed in a final miracle, a last stand that would somehow turn the tide. But that miracle would never come. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army launched its final offensive, the Battle of Berlin. Over 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, backed by 22,000 tanks and artillery pieces, stormed toward the German capital. A ragtag force of SS units, Hitler Youth, and old men from the Volkssturm, a last-ditch militia, defended the city. The fighting was brutal. Streets turned into battlegrounds. Soviet artillery pounded Berlin day and night. The German defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with desperation, but they had no chance. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler took his own life. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12 years. Just 1 week later, on May 7th, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, was declared on May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe was over. For the Allies, it was a moment of triumph, but also reflection. Millions had died. Cities lay in ruins. The horrors of the Holocaust had been fully uncovered, revealing the true evil of the Nazi regime. And yet, even as celebrations erupted in the streets of London, Paris, and New York, one reality remained. The war was not over. The Pacific Theater was still raging. Japan had yet to surrender. Another bloody battle was on the horizon. But for now in Europe, the guns had finally fallen silent. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't just another battle. It was the largest and deadliest battle fought by American forces in World War II. More than 600,000 American troops were involved. Nearly 90,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. For Germany, it was even worse. Hitler had gambled everything on this offensive: his best troops, his last fuel reserves, and his final hope for turning the war around. But in the end, he had lost over 100,000 men and burned through resources that could never be replaced. It was a point of no return. After the Ardennes, Germany was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to survive. For the Allies, the battle was a brutal reminder of war's unpredictability. Intelligence failures, overconfidence, and the unexpected resilience of the enemy had nearly cost them dearly. Had the weather not cleared in time for air support, or had Patton's counterattack been delayed, the outcome could have been very different. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of young soldiers on both sides never returned home. The forests of the Ardennes became a vast graveyard, a haunting reminder of the price of war. And yet, from this battle came some of the greatest acts of heroism ever recorded. The soldiers who fought in the bitter cold, who endured the Siege of Bastogne, and who never gave up, even when outnumbered and outgunned, became legends. Their sacrifices would never be forgotten. The war in Europe was ending, but a new struggle was beginning. As the Allies moved deeper into Germany, tensions between the Western powers and the Soviet Union began to rise. The division of Germany, the fate of Eastern Europe, and the looming question of what came next. All of it set the stage for the Cold War. The Battle of the Bulge had shown the world something crucial. Preparedness mattered. The United States and its allies would never again be caught off guard like they were in December 1944. This battle helped shape modern military strategy, intelligence gathering, and even the formation of NATO, as the world braced itself for a new era of conflict. Remembering the Battle of the Bulge today, the scars of the battle remain. The forests of the Ardennes still hold the wreckage of tanks, the remains of bunkers, and the memories of those who fought there. Memorials in Bastogne, Malmedy, and Luxembourg stand as solemn reminders of the battle's impact. Veterans who survived returned years later, standing where they once fought, remembering the friends they lost. For the world, the Battle of the Bulge is more than history. It is a lesson, a warning of what happens when war consumes nations. It is a story of heroism, sacrifice, and resilience. It was Hitler's last gamble, and it ended in disaster.